It's hard in some ways because they play such different positions, so it's not even there are no real apples to apples here.
The most valuable player in the NBA. Who is your selection?
As a bit of a preamble, I think my top tier is two players, and I think that both of them, it's a tier. That means I think they're both deserving of the number one honor, and they've thankfully played, I believe, significant amount. Yeah, they're significantly similar amounts, so it's not a decision that's based on that. And those two are Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Nikola Jokic. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is having an incredible season. I mean, so the Thunder have one of the best offenses in the league when he is on the floor. He is, of course, an integral part of that. I believe he has the largest total usage on the team when he's on the floor. And he has been a really productive defender, of course, leading the league in steals and everything else. And so I ended up going with Jokic 1 and Shai 2 for a couple of reasons that I don't know how much time we want to spend on it. One is that Jokic has a significantly larger role within Denver's offense. And part of that
Wait,
is,
hold on. Is it his Shai's total usage is 49?
Sorry, I was at the wrong line. I was at the wrong line. Yeah, it's 0.5%. That's not that large. But I think there are some spillovers that you benefit with Jokic. In some ways, weirdly, like how they get with Chet Holmgren, where having him credibly space the floor, having him as a hub, all of the plays, we talked about this on Wednesday night's pod about LeBron. The plays that Jokic creates, even if he doesn't get credited for a basket or an assist. And there are plenty of those for Shai as well. He's a wonderful driver. He's an aggressive driver. And so I think even though the margin is relatively tight between those two in total usage, I think that Jokic is a bigger reason why their offense is what it is. And when you think about the teammates that he can have in some ways because of that, and that helps their defense and everything else. So I think there is a completely credible argument to have Shai number one. I have zero opposition to that. I'm still having Jokic 1 for now.
I don't think that there is a clear statistical winner when you're comparing these two. I think all the stuff that we look at are quite similar. Shai, 33 traditional usage. That's just a percentage of his team's possessions as scoring attempts or turnovers. True shooting, 65%. Jokic, 29.5. True shooting, 65%. Seth Partnow's total usage, which includes playmaking usage, which is, of course, the number of passes that you make that lead directly to a shot, whether it goes in or not, almost entirely the same. Jokic makes up for his slight deficit in scoring usage by more playmaking usage. Shai is significantly lower on turnovers, and that's one of the crazy things about Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, that his turnover usage is only 2.7% given the number of drives that he has. And he basically has the lowest turnover usage of any of these guys that are really in consideration for all NBA, who have, do a significant amount of scoring and passing in their team's offense. Estimated plus minus, like Shai better. Nikola Jokic is higher on offense, but Shai is plus 2.6 on defense. Jokic is actually negative 1.2. I think that is too harsh on Nikola Jokic, but I would consider Shai Gilgeous-Alexander the more valuable defender when you consider the replacement level of their position. But I do think that Nikola Jokic has gotten a lot better defensively. He talked about that recently, that particularly on defense, he's just has a much greater understanding than he did before. And he's still not a great traditional rim protector, but he does take up space in there. He's got the fat guy defense. He'll strip guys. Denver's rim defense has gotten much better. Some of that's him. Some of it is that you've got more Peyton Watson types than they've had before. Estimated Raptor, which Neil Payne put together, RIP. Regular Raptor, pretty much similar. Again, like Shai, a little bit better defensively. 9.7 for Shai, 8.9 for Jokic. Team offensive rating when they're on the floor. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, 121.8. Nikola Jokic, 122.2. And we don't look at the off as much. The Nuggets are atrocious when Jokic is off the floor. Again, they're 18 points per 100 better than when he is off the floor. And then Shai, still a very good number, 10.4 better. And I would say Shai probably has more offensive talent around him, or at least more offensive talent and spacing around him than Jokic. probably a little bit better of a system. Defense, neither affects their team's defense too much, but both of them have solid defenses around the floor. Team net rating when they're on the floor, Shai 11.6, Jokic 10.1. That's a little bit below where he was last year, which was 13.3, which was by far the best of any of these candidates. This year, you actually have a lot of these candidates who are into double digits, which is a difference from what it was a season ago. So would you agree with my assessment, Danny, that there just isn't really much way to parse between these guys on a pure statistical basis?
Yes, I would, and it's hard in some ways because they play such different positions. So it's not even there are no real apples to apples here, and their overall role within the offense is similar, but how they do it is very different. But in terms of overall impact, yeah, I think it's completely fair to say they're comparable. That's why they're in the same tier for me.
Yeah, and I would put them in the same tier as well. Two reasons I ultimately went with Nikola Jokic as my pick, as did you. One, I would say that I think Shai's job is a little bit easier. Jokic plays with a lot of very bench-heavy units. The Nuggets are not a good three-point shooting team. They don't really space the floor that well. I would say that Jokic has Jamal Murray, who's probably a little more talented offensive player than anyone else that Shai plays with. But Shai is playing with basically 5-out spacing all the time, unless you want to say Josh Giddey is not 5-out. And you can put your center on him, but having that stretch five, that is just such a cheat code offensively. And Shai has certainly been effective at times, but in the Daigneault, with less shooting, but in the Daigneault era, they've largely kind of gone 5-out. Their transition game is incredible. I think that Shai's job is a little bit easier given the personnel around him.
And one of the other differences, I brought up how Jokic kind of makes a lot of the Nuggets thing work, is that Shai is a wonderful player. He's number 2 in MVP for a reason. But if they didn't have Chet Holmgren, who is an anomalous player, then a lot of this stuff would be worse. And he isn't the anomaly in some ways that Chet is. And so Jokic being like, and Shai has his own unusual strengths, but Jokic being the player who also makes that component of it work, the reason that, Denver doesn't originally play 5-out, they succeeded in a different way. But that's something there. One thing I will give Shai credit for, and I hadn't done the digging on this until it was through that 15 and 60, that Gilgeous-Alexander does spend a lot of time on the floor when Chet Holmgren is off, and their offense is fantastic during that stretch too. So that's a feather in his cap.
But they also play with Kendrick Williams. They have another stretch guy. They play small. They don't really play another traditional big. Jalen Williams maybe a little bit.
And their rotation is so good that it's not like they're playing, they're playing some of the guys that Denver has on the floor, the equivalent of what Denver has on the floor when Jokic is off, let's say.
Yeah, so your argument for Shai is basically never turns it over and just more valuable defender at his position, relative to the rest of his position, right? Like you might say Jokic, all right, if you're got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Nikola Jokic at the basket when you're trying to drive, Nikola Jokic probably has a better chance of stopping that guy. But when you're talking about Shai versus another point guard, ball handling guard, and Jokic versus another center, the difference is because when you play Shai, you can also play a Chet Holmgren, and you're probably not going to do that with Jokic, although I'm sure Jokic could make that work. But ultimately, my second tiebreaker that I think is more meaningful to me, and I do consider this very close to a tie as far as their performance this season, is just I think Nikola Jokic is better. He's proven more. He's been at this level for a very long time. We've seen him completely dominate in the playoffs, and I don't go to just who I think is the better guy by default, but if it's this close, that is where I end up. And so I'm just more comfortable with how unbelievably awesome Nikola Jokic is. He will probably be my pick for the number 1 player in the NBA. I don't know that Shai is even necessarily going to be number 2 when we do that. So that's ultimately the tiebreaker for me. Shai is number 2. Anything else to add there, or should we move down the table?
We can move down the table, and my next tier is also 2 guys. And in part that is due to some of the injuries and absences and stuff. Like, obviously, Joel Embiid would be firmly in this conversation had he done. Anyway, we acknowledge that. For me,
he has already missed so many games that he is no longer eligible. And Also, I mean, it'll be interesting. We'll put a pin in whether he would actually still make one of our All NBA teams as of now. But surely, having only played 34 games, and Shai has played 57.
I'll go even stronger. I had it just as a question, not as something. I'm like, if Joel Embiid were still eligible, would I have picked him 5th for MVP? And the answer is maybe. I don't know. But so the next two guys, again, their overall profiles, I think, are somewhat. Their overall impact is somewhat similar, though they do it in very different ways, and that's Luka Doncic and Giannis Antetokounmpo. And I think that there are times where, I mean, we've talked about how Giannis is having one of the most efficient seasons of his career, in part because he's just not shooting threes anymore, which kudos. Like, that is a good thing for him. And while this isn't Antetokounmpo's best defensive season, he is obviously a significantly better defender than Luka Doncic is. And not only in the obvious sense of, like, he's better, but in the way that, like, you don't have to you game plan for him as a defensive player. Like, he makes Doc Rivers' life easier, and Luka makes Jason Kidd's life harder on the defensive end. But it is worth taking a beat to appreciate not only how large Luka Doncic's role is within his offense, but how great the Dallas offense is overall.
It's very good. I mean, we have Giannis's Bucks with a better on-court offensive rating than Luka's Mavs.
True.
I mean, it's amazing, and I do think, obviously, I don't know, the Mavs don't have anyone as good as Malik Beasley. Obviously, Leonard has fallen off some, but he's a huge threat. Even someone like Chris Middleton, who's been in and out of the lineup, is probably better than the Mavs' third best offensive player by quite a bit. Kyrie has missed half the season, so there is a massive drop off. You might say, all right, well, Luka has worse talent around him, so the Mavs are 9.4 points per 100 better offensively with Luka on the floor. Well, the Bucks have a greater difference when Giannis is on the floor, 10.5, and about a point better in terms of the raw offensive rating when he's on the floor. So I would be of the belief that Luka Doncic is the better offensive player than Giannis Antetokounmpo. I think that just because of his passing ability and the way he controls everything, Giannis's total usage is quite high, 49%, but Luka's is the highest of anyone we're considering for All NBA by 5 percentage points, and that's even with his scoring usage down by quite a bit, but also his playmaking usage is second among anyone we're seriously considering behind Tyrese Halliburton in Seth's stats. So both of these guys have very good resumes. Giannis obviously is much better defensively. I've said that I don't really feel him as much on every possession. He's not going to be featuring the defensive player of the year conversation the way he has in the past, although I think he's maybe under Doc Rivers that can change a little bit. But Luka, while he's made some strides, is still a pretty active negative defensively as a power forward, which is the position that he defends. So yeah, he's like, there's some stats about like, oh, he's like pretty good defending isolations or something. The reason for that is that the Mavs only let him get stuck in an isolation in a matchup that he can handle, because they're just going to double team if he can't handle the matchup, and it won't count as an isolation. So Luka's, he can defend in the post, he's okay, but he's just doesn't protect the rim at all. He's a solid rebounder, but again, he's a power forward, right? Like he's not like some amazing rebounder for his defensive position, and that's who he has to guard. And so he causes some problems for your defense when he's the low man or when he has to track a shooter. And obviously there's the getting back on defense portion. So I do consider this one a virtual heat as well. I did go with Giannis in the end for my number 3 position, with Luka being number 4, but I certainly understand the argument for Doncic, and that's there's not really, I don't have a great argument, I feel, for why Giannis is 3. That's just how it felt to me.
I ended up with the same place, but one other thing I want to say in favor of Luka is that, sort of like Jokic, his brilliance allows the Mavericks to play more limited players and have them, first of all, have them be efficient and have the overall offense be efficient. And I think that's really important. So you can have, I mean, some would say Grant Williams, but I'm thinking more the Derek Jones Jr. and to an extent Dante Exum type of players. Like, you can have them in your rotation, and that helps make their defense better. Like Luka is not a good defender in any way, but having him there, and you could argue the same. This Bucks team has significantly worse perimeter defensive talent than many of theirs have in the past, and they're still, they're still a 112 defensive.
They might have the worst until they got Patrick Beverley. They might have had the worst perimeter defensive talent in the whole league.
Entirely possible. And so for them to, and they're also, that overall defensive sample includes a lot of time relative with Griffin, who was concocting schemes that didn't necessarily maximize his players. And so I'm not gonna hold the season long numbers against Giannis, even though the Bucks are below their usual standard. They have a worse coach, they have a different coach, all that type of stuff. So yeah, I had Giannis 3, Luka 4. I could, again, they're in the same tier.
Yeah, by the way, a couple other things on them. EPM, Giannis 7.4, Luka 7.5. And then estimated Raptor, very similar as well. Luka 6.4, Giannis 7.4. Bucks net rating with Giannis on the floor plus 7.5. Luka plus 3.3 net rating when he's on the floor. For the Mavs, that's a feather in Giannis's cap. Again, it's kind of, do we need to get into like how is Dallas's talent versus the Bucks? And they do Lillard versus Kyrie, and like how much of those guys been available, and then how much? What about the other talent? It just, I think ultimately I have to go in the direction of Giannis, and then number 5 is going to be interesting. Who'd you have there?
It ends up being kind of an uninspiring crop relative because there are some guys who are like Joel Embiid who are really good but haven't played quite enough, and then there are other guys who just haven't like they don't necessarily have that kind of a resume. And I ended up being persuaded by a player who is actually pretty high in what's called estimated wins. So basically what that is EPM's version of, you take their all-in-one metric and then you combine it with minutes played. Somebody who's actually high on that is technically even with Joel Embiid, and that's Jalen Brunson. And Brunson,
holy shit! Okay.
So Jalen Brunson's role within the offense. So we're getting into that kind of thing. Like it's less than the highest guys, but it's not that much. And the Knicks have one of the best offenses in the league when he's on the floor, and have a significantly worse one when he is off. And in his case, I don't think that's quite the same, especially because remember, Immanuel Quickley was on the Knicks for a lot of this year. And so they had a capable, second unit point guard for most of the year. They did have a flawed stretch with that, and then they got Bogdanovich and Burks. One of the other things in favor of Brunson, other than a little recent jag, he's played a lot. And that is something that matters for most valuable players. Something I do not consider as much for All-NBA, and I will mention right now, Jalen Brunson is not on my first team All-NBA. Because I still, the longtime listeners will know my process there. And Brunson's not a great defensive player. And I mean, he's been a part of a reasonably successful defense. I will note that the Knicks defense has been significantly better when he's been off the floor, but I haven't done all the digging on it, but I don't think that's like because Jalen Brunson is bad. It's just the nature of how these things work. The Knicks generally have a really good second unit defense. So there are a lot of players worthy of consideration. I will talk about a lot of them at length in the second team All-NBA, but he has a large role in a successful offense and has played a ton. And so, for example, like Kawhi Leonard has had a very good year. Kawhi Leonard is, he'll be second team NBA. Jalen Brunson has played more than 200 more minutes than him. That is, more than a couple of extra games. And my thought is the difference that he has made is close, like and a few of these other guys that I'll talk about in the second team. And he's played more than them. So if if you want to talk about estimated wins, like he's obviously lower in wins above replacement, which is the Raptor version of the same stat. I was slightly persuaded. There are a lot of other guys, and I'll talk about who I have first team All-NBA over him later on. But I thought his resume, there's this group of next guys is probably like 3 or 4 dudes long. But I thought that he had the best overall impact.
Yeah, I think to me, Brunson's argument, I had Jalen Brunson on my third team All-NBA, so not anywhere close to even in consideration for me, honestly. I mean, to me, his argument comes down to having played a lot of minutes, and the Knicks have a 121 offensive rating when he's on the floor. He's not despite the fact that he competes and takes charges, like he's still, I would consider him to be a defensive negative. He's someone who's going to get attacked defensively. Teams regularly do that. And to me, Kawhi Leonard, the Clippers defense is so much better when he's on the floor. They have just, they're basically like maybe the second or third best defense when he's on the floor, and one of the worst when he's off the floor. 8.9 points per 100 defensively, and there's not a crap ton of shooting luck in that number. And then they're also, and consider that he's had James Harden and Paul George on his team, they've been doing some staggering. They're still significantly better offensively when he plays as well, plus 8.9 net rating when he's on, negative 3.5 when he's off. That plus 12.4 differential is, I would say, let's see, of the people that we're seriously considering for all NBA, that's probably fourth. Paul George, interestingly, is actually plus 16. However, I think Kawhi is the main guy there, and I think he's just been having his best defensive season, I would say, as a Clipper right now. That makes a difference, and I think there's still a pretty good argument that Kawhi is as good or better of an offensive player than Brunson. Brunson not terribly efficient with 59% true shooting, and I just don't think he's like that amazing of a passer. That's one of the things that really kind of sticks out to me. And the Knicks offense is still like, I still think of Brunson as kind of a floor raiser. He's been very efficient from three, but the Knicks offense is built a lot on the possession game as well. So I ultimately, Kawhi was the guy for me. I didn't have it as all that close. And,
well, so I want to bring up,
Kawhi's way
thing.
better than Brunson, or frankly, anybody else that was in consideration for me, other than maybe Kevin Durant.
One of the things you brought up, that the shooting, there isn't a big disparity, which is correct with Kawhi on and off the floor. There is another element. I looked into this very briefly. I'm not going to talk about it at length because I don't have the sufficient knowledge. Is Zubats. So like when Kawhi and Zubats are on the floor, the Clippers defense is incredible. They're above 90th percentile. I think they're like 92nd or 93rd percentile. And then when Kawhi plays without Zubats, the Clippers defense is fine. It's above average, but it's not particularly great.
Worth noting, a lot of that is going to be with no center at all.
Exactly, but then you think about, generally speaking, Ty Lue's rotations are the minutes that most of the minutes that Zubats plays are going to be with Kawhi Leonard, which means that the sample isn't representative necessarily in that sense that you would say normally, where the player who for me is most important for the Clippers defense, in part because of his replacements, just happens to play more of his minutes, a higher proportion with Kawhi than not with Kawhi. And so I think I would need to do, like, if this is an MVP thing at the end of the year, I will do probably an hour's worth of work on this, on whether I think that is significant. But my read on it is that I think at times Kawhi is getting too much credit for something that is partially him, but is also the combination of Zubats being really good and his replacements being horrendous defensively. And so that makes this a little bit different, and apportioning credit and blame in these circumstances can be really complicated. Actually, there are centers who benefit from this and don't. I wanted to mention that. I mean, I have Kawhi above Jalen Brunson on my All-NBA teams. He's not actually the guy I have first team, but he is above Jalen Brunson as well. But for me, the margin between those two guys, especially when you consider the role within their respective offenses, like I think Jalen Brunson has to do more there, and I think that he has done a very good job. I think that his surrounding talent offensively is significantly worse than the Clippers overall, even if this Clippers team isn't what the Clippers were, the year that they're the best shooting team in the NBA.
Last thing on this, Brunson has played a bunch of minutes. I tend to look a little bit more towards games played than minutes, and Kawhi 51 games, Brunson 55.